What's up, y'all? It's Zach with the Living Quarter Podcast Network. Y'all know what we do, man. Y'all know. Listen, man, we try to drop. Come on, Simon, give me them air horns right here. More fire for your head top. And look, today is no different. I ain't even gonna get into a huge, long kind of like intro before I get into the interview, because our interview was kind of long, but I really want y'all to hear all of it. I interviewed someone who is a strong, seriously, like one of the leaders within the D&I space when you talk about like presenting content around intersectionality, diversity, inclusion. Her name is Jennifer Brown. She's a facilitator. She's a public speaker. She's a consultant. She's an educator. She has a background in change management. So there's a lot of symbiosis between the both of us. And we had a really dope discussion just about what it really means to be inclusive as a leader. And then we had a conversation, like kind of like a meta discussion about the D&I space as an industry. If y'all remember, this is like way back in season 1. We had Amy C. Waninger, and then we had Drew, aka Very White Guy, on the show. And Drew talked a little bit about the like the D&I as a business, right? And kind of like the capitalistic or corporate nature of D&I and like what that looks like. And we had a conversation about that too. It's really interesting. So anyway, what you're going to hear next is the discussion between Jennifer Brown and myself. She's great people. Definitely can't wait to have her back on the show. Make sure y'all check out the show notes. You can look and see all of her information, including her latest 2 books. Okay, so make sure y'all check it out, and we'll catch y'all next time. Peace. Jennifer, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Oh, thanks. I'm doing great. Trying to stay cool in this July.
Man, it is hot out here.
Yeah, global warming.
Now, I gave a brief, for real, let's be. Now, look, I gave a brief intro, but for those who don't know you, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Of course, yeah. Let's see, I'm an author, I'm a keynoter, I'm a CEO and owner of a consulting business, all of which is focused on building more inclusive workplaces for all kinds of talent to thrive. And it's a passionate personal mission that I have because I've been out since I was 22 and I'm in my 40s now. And, but the workplace was a place where I couldn't really bring my full self to work. And I want to say it wasn't just being LGBTQ. I mean, the workplace has all sorts of inclusiveness problems. When it comes to people like, us and, most people, actually, anyone that's not a certain mold. And so as somebody I have a master's degree in opera, believe it or not, I came to New York to be an opera singer, and that did not work out. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. Luckily, I reinvented as a corporate trainer because it's all this, it's like being on the stage, and connecting with audiences. It's just the topic is different. So I reinvented into that field, which remains really my field to this day. So we're a strategy and training company, and we're working across the Fortune 1000, I would say, on a daily basis. My team is all over the country. They're amazing. They're so talented at what they do. They have a lot more patience for client work than I do. And yeah, we could talk about that if you want. But I've been a consultant in the trenches for a long time, and I'm actually really thrilled now to kind of be more living the keynote and author life. I like it a lot. I love performing. I love big audiences. I like the challenge of thinking on my feet. I like having to write books on this topic and figure out, like, what does the world need me to write next, and how do I take what I hear and learn and put it in a way that's digestible for people, because it's kind of like a life or death situation from an inclusion perspective, and I deeply feel that for myself and many, many others.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. Awesome. I'm already like, my shoulders kind of bouncing up and down. It's going to be a dope conversation.
Woo! Yeah.
So today we're talking about inclusive leadership. And before we get too deep into it, can we get some definitions on these terms, like from your point of view?
Yeah.
Diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality. Because in your content and in your IP, both written and your presentations, like, you use these terms a lot. And frankly, your content is centered around these terms. For our audience, I'd love it if we could just like level set what these things actually mean.
Yes, and you need to consider the history of the conversation. So in the corporate and workplace context, diversity has been traditionally the who, right? The demographics, the representation in your workforce. Typically, it's count gender, right, which is where it started, and race and ethnicity. It wants to count LGBTQ and people with disabilities, but a lot of those folks can hide who they are, right? We are very good at hiding who we are and not checking boxes. So diversity has really been that representation, the mix, the complexion of the workplace with a small c. And then inclusion really is the how. So how do I make that mix work? If diversity is the who in the mix, how do I make the mix work? To quote my friend Tyrone Studemeyer, who is like a great chief diversity officer, he always uses that example. In fact, he brings a glass of milk on stage and pours in chocolate sauce, and then he stirs it, and he has this bit that he does. So it's making the mix work, and honestly, that's really where behaviors come into play. And so it's how, once you have that talent around the table, how do you make them want to stay? How do you include them? And how do you make them feel that they're valued? And so inclusion is the how and the behaviors. And then intersectionality, something totally different. It is the mix, I guess, of diverse identities that make some of us who we are and kind of present unique challenges. Traditionally defined by Kimberly Crenshaw, of course, it's the mix of multiple stigmatized identities that one person may carry. So why that's important is that I think, anyone who looks at gender, for example, issues as a white women's topic is not taking into consideration how women of color impacted differently, how being a LGBTQ woman may mean that you're not only dealing with your gender and all the headwinds that come along with that, but you're dealing with the headwinds are relating to sexual orientation, or say you have a non-binary gender expression, or you are a woman of color and some of those things at the same time, or a woman with a disability. So it just goes on, and that's a very helpful thing for the rest of the world, I think, to help people understand the levels of, and I would use privilege with a small p. I know that word sets some people off, but
sure.
But I think we have to be realistic about some of us walking through the world feeling a lot safer and a lot more protected, a lot more supported, right? Like a lot more, that others are more comfortable with us, and because they're relatively more familiar with us. And the sort of further you get away from, I guess, the straight white male norm that is like it or not the whole of the top leadership in the business world, the further you get from that, I think the more difficulty you have in kind of seeing yourself in workplaces, in being supported, grown, invested in, welcomed, proactively fostered, all the things that really like pull you up in an organization. So, when you're different in multiple ways, it's kind of difficult to ever feel that you're in that, in the place you should be. In the machine that is the workplace. So, this is where people fall out, they quit, they can't stand it anymore. They go and become entrepreneurs, which is great, but sad for corporations and large employers, because of course, you're bleeding out all of your diverse talent because your culture is sort of something that people can't stand. Right. That's a problem.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting, right? Because I was just having a conversation with a couple of close friends this morning, and I was talking about the fact that a lot of times, when we talk about D&I in the most common context, it almost feels like really a competition between white men and white women for number one, and then kind of everybody else falls to the wayside.
Right.
Like we don't necessarily have I don't know if I'm necessarily always hearing truly intersectional discussions about around identity. I don't know, and I don't know if black women are often centered in those discussions. Now, of course, in the past couple of years, we've seen more and more content come out about it. So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer, but at the same time,
you're right.
Right.
You're right.
I mean,
you happen to be right.
Here's a great example, right? So I think it was, Indeed. So Indeed just dropped a commercial, and it was like the setting was like a boardroom, right? And in the boardroom, a white man was in the front, and he was getting a promotion, right? And the boss was shaking his hand and everybody was clapping. And then there was a white woman, and she was just kind of standing there. And it was clearly, like, by the framing, right, of the commercial, that she was passed over for this promotion, and that the white man got the promotion over her, right? And I was like, okay. And so then she looks down at her phone and she kind of smirks because she gets a notification she's getting an interview, somewhere else, right?
Oh my God.
Right? So she's like, oh, because I'm leaving. And it said, Indeed. I was like, okay, cool. So great commercial. But what's interesting about that commercial was behind the white woman, and I don't believe they did this intentionally, but maybe they did. And if they did, they are super cold. But there was a black woman and a black man out of focus right behind her. And so it was like super interesting. Like,
somebody needs to give that feedback. I'm sure they've heard about it already.
and so just
really,
but like the idea that a lot of times we talk about D&I is often centered around gender, and we're not having really authentic discussions outside of that. And so question for you, in your book, Inclusion, Diversity, the New Workplace, and the Will to Change, you discuss the nuances of privilege, and you just talked about lowercase p privilege, and to make an effort not to vilify white men who have, quote, seemingly won the privilege lottery. Is it possible to manage the egos of leaders who are in the majority while also having frank and accountable discussions about empowering black and brown professionals or just non-white professionals in the workplace? In your work, what does that process look like to establish trust for those discussions?
Yeah, I mean, that is really the work. And I think it's like the third rail. Honestly, it's funny being in the LGBTQ community, there's strangely, a level of comfort and acceptance of talking about I'm a proud ally, or putting that rainbow sticker on your desk or right in your email signature. And it's fascinating to me because, by the way, the LGBTQ conversation is also not properly intersectional, right? So there's privilege dynamics playing out in this community. I say my community, one of my communities, that women's voices aren't well heard. People of color in the LGBTQ community, trans people are not well heard, right, and are not represented in leadership positions in the workplace when it comes to affinity groups and things. So each community has its kind of diversity within its diversity challenges. So I just wanted to make that point because I often say just because you carry a marginalized identity or even two does not make you an inclusive leader. Like,
that's so true.
I wish it were true, but it's not. And it's been proven to me over and over again that, I've made that assumption and I've kind of been wrong. Like, I've been shocked by what people say. And so these, like, a lack of that intersectional lens and that inclusive lens can live in all of us, by the way. Elitism and, that blindness and bias, unchecked. So anyway, so that's one point I want to make. But so how do we center more black and brown voices when the leadership of so many companies, and when you say they are the majority, we always have to clarify. I say majority in leadership positions because if you look in the aggregate in most companies, of course, women are the majority.
That's absolutely correct, yeah.
Right. And then a lot of ethnic diversity lives in different functional areas of the business and, whatever. Right. But it totally thins out like when you go up the org chart. Right. So the problem is all the power lies with a sort of a very homogeneous group. And so the onus is on that group to acknowledge that the world is more and more black and brown. Right. That they have to build that competency and cross those bridges of understanding. And they have to know how to build trust with their workforce, both current and future, by the way, which is most likely not going to look like them. Right. And then they've got to do it in such a way that then their employee and their leadership base looks like the world that they serve. Which is increasingly female, right? Think about the buying decisions. Think about the exploding buying power of the black community. The LGBTQ community is now $1 trillion of buying power. I mean, it's massive. So any brand that's worth anything and any leader that's worth anything must look at this, should look at this and say, my demographic group, maybe it was okay for me not to understand what keeps people in the organization I'm a part of, or keeps people on my team, or how to be a good colleague and sort of step out of my shoes and think about what the other person's experience is like. But, I better start to pay attention to this. So my argument is always like, I throw the business case to people, the demographic argument to people. Sometimes it's a moral argument. Sometimes somebody, has kids of a different race than they are. Sometimes they have lots of daughters. Like sometimes, they have a unique view on all of this. And so when somebody that looks like a white straight guy, you just never know what their diversity story might be.
Yeah.
And I've been just shocked and reminded that, I can walk in a room and people assume I know nothing about this topic, and that's happened to me. I've been on the receiving end of that. So, and there are things I don't know for sure, but I desperately want people to listen to my story and somehow kind of wedge my way in and make them listen and convince them and all those things. So, being LGBTQ helps with that. So I'm this interesting hybrid of, being of an identity that people are more comfortable with, like based on maybe what they see, but then coming out and challenging them to the point where like you can hear a pin drop when I do that.
Right.
And that's kind of, let me tell you, it's pretty uncomfortable when you're standing there in front of like 1,000 mostly men in like light blue short shirts and khakis. And you're like, how's this going to go? So it takes, for all of us, I think it takes bravery to show ourselves. For some of us with invisible aspects of diversity, it takes kind of a unique kind of bravery to be like, no, like make no mistake, like this is actually who I am. And particularly if it's a vulnerable aspect of who you are, it can feel really risky. That can include like divulging about a disability or, mental health and addiction issues or age. There's just this like widespread hesitation to bring our full selves to work on so many counts. But when you are Black and brown, of course, the issue can be, I can't opt not to show who I am. Like who I am is often visible, and it will trigger the biases if those are there, right? And so it's this conversation we always have about, it's not the Pain Olympics, and that's so important to remember, like that it's not a race to the through the oppression hierarchy to say, right? It's because that's a useless conversation. I think we have to think about like, what's the damage that happens when we feel shame or we feel compelled to downplay who we are, even if it's very visible to others. And how can we support each other's voices and create that safety for each other? And that's what I think about every day. Like if I have been given some kind of privilege with a small p or several of ways that has been totally unearned by me, my obsession is like, what responsibility and opportunity does that come with? And which is interesting because I'm in the LGBT community, which is so used to needing that allyship, right? We think about, we struggle to bring our full selves and be comfortable, and we hide, and so allies really bring us out, right? They stand alongside us and say, hey, I'll tell your story. I'll be next to you. I'll have your back. It feels amazing to have that. And I know what that feeling feels like, and so I am turning around and like trying to do that for others with my people, which often is my lovely, often good-hearted, white straight male executive clients. To say, how can we help you bridge to the future? Because opting out that's not an option. I think, and the more clued in ones know this, and I think people are mostly feeling just really like wanting to do more, very awkward, very afraid. I know in the light of Me Too, it's just purely a gender conversation. That Lean In research that came out a couple months ago says that like male leaders are like even more afraid now to be in these one-on-one scenarios with female mentees or colleagues. And it's really discouraging, and it's definitely going in the wrong direction. But I think that fear is probably bigger than just cross-gender. I think that it's just kind of any moves you might make to say, hey, I want to be an inclusive leader. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I really, really want to be better. Yeah. But how am I going to learn? How am I going to learn this thing that I'm going to get wrong? And where am I going to learn it? And how am I going to know that I'm getting it wrong? And then how am I going to be given a chance to develop better skills? And that's a very legitimate question. So I think we've got to all kind of give each other a lot of birth and also proactive support these days to learn. And we got to do that in partnership with each other, because otherwise we were learning in a vacuum, and that's hard to do. It's
so complex though, right? Because it's like there has to be space for grace, and then there also like on both sides, because there's grace for you to learn. There's grace for me to give you space to learn, but then there has to be humility for you to receive that learning, right? And then there needs to be empathy on the person who is learning for their teacher, in that there's a level of emotional labor, right? That goes into me even talking to you about this at all, right? I had a conversation with some colleagues like about a month or so ago, and I was talking to them, and I was like, look, like something happened, and it was an educational discussion, and part of my conversation said, hey, I said, I don't talk about this because it's exhausting. I said, but being in these majority white spaces, just me being here is exhausting. And I explained that to them. I said, and it's not just me. It's exhausting. It's exhausting in some way or form or shape for someone in a minority to engage in majority spaces. Like it is. And so like, for the people that are doing the work to educate and train and teach or even partner, like that's like there needs to be some empathy on that part. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, we talk a lot about compassion fatigue. And I think that, and then being asked to step forward and represent an entire community and their experience, which you and I know is never going to be accurate. You're just one person talking about your experience.
Not
right. But what you're talking about is something, what I say in my next book, right, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, is that you need to do 80% of the emotional labor yourself before you ask someone to help you on your journey.
Oh, I love that.
It's so important, yes. And so for me, what that looks like is I intentionally consume certain media. For example, I listen to certain podcasts. I watch certain films. I acquaint myself with cultural norms across communities that are not mine, right? And in some cases, it's a struggle through some of that media, because that media is not built for you.
Right.
It's not a conversation for you.
Right.
And I've had white friends, and I talk about like a podcast we may love, like one I love called Still Processing. I don't know if you know it.
Oh yeah. Still Processing.
So good.
Shout out to y'all. Yes.
Oh, so good. So good. And they're queer too. Like I just love them. I mean, there's talk about intersectional. They're brilliant.
Yeah, they're great.
And anyway, and I sometimes have a hard time keeping up with it, but also getting all the cultural references. And sometimes even I will feel, gosh, like I'm such an outsider. And this is so uncomfortable for me to try to hang in with the conversation. And then I say to myself, and this is what I say to leaders, notice the discomfort, because this is what other people feel every single day in majority white spaces, every day of their lives, right?
Yes.
Like you're uncomfortable for 1 second, right? Yes. Like get used to it. Like you should be putting yourself in this discomfort all the time, because this is the competency. Like this is the skill that you need to learn so that you get some iota of empathy for what it feels like every single day for other people. The other thing I wanted to say is we just had an LGBTQ, we called it LBTQ. It was just for women, actually. So we dropped the G.
Yeah, okay.
Which is, people can have issues with it, but we dropped the G. It was just meant for Q-identified women.
Okay.
And we had this big conference, and we had a ton of diversity on the stage, which was my commitment. And we had a couple activists that were trans women of color. And they said, I will come, but I want you to know, like, Pride is exhausting for me. It was in June. It's exhausting for me. It's exhausting for me to walk into corporate spaces, to educate, to be that voice on stage. And, I'm sort of doing this, but I want you to know it's like a lot of labor for me. And I guess for all of us that put panels together, for all of us that are speakers and on panels, it was such a learning for me to understand that when you ask someone, you're trying to be inclusive, and but it is so seen through this lens of, I can take the day and go speak at this conference because I work for myself, or, I'm an activist or an advocate. Like, an activist doesn't always look the same or have the same level of privilege or income. What is the lost income from taking a day out to go into a space you're not comfortable in and educate people about your experience. Like, it was really humbling. And what we ended up doing, by the way, and this may be helpful advice, is for all the speakers that day, we had 30 speakers. We really want to intend that we have a stipend and honorarium for people who take the time out to come into that space. There's a question of real money, to offset that time and that labor. And again, this was another kind of learning for a lot of privileged people of the privilege that allows them to come in and speak all the time on things, that have a full-time job, that have benefits, that aren't on, witnessing, the really, really painful reality of certain parts of our community every day. I just thought it was a really interesting demonstration within a marginalized community of sort of the gulf in our experiences, right? Even
Absolutely.
Within LGBTQ women. So I think being mindful of intersectionality all the time, it's incumbent on anybody who has that platform, that voice, that comfort, to whatever degree, to ensure spaces are diverse, to ensure voices are elevated, to center stories that aren't our own, and to make sure that those stories are given the proper platform, and that people aren't overly requested to give of their time and education. But that means that each white person, each man, when they support gender equality, I would ask, like, what are you reading? What research do you have under your belt? Like, how are you exercising your muscle to show up in allyship? And what are you doing? And then, and only then, can you ask for tweaks and feedback from people in affected communities? Did what I say resonate? Did I do this justice? Did I use my voice in the right way? What more could I have done?
Right.
Like, what feedback would you have for me?
Yeah.
That can be asked, but so much has to be done and earned before that. And then bring somebody in to give you that feedback and make you better. Because, without that feedback, I can promise you people aren't going to get better, and they're just going to keep stumbling. And stumbling is not good for anyone.
No, you're absolutely right.
Humiliating.
And the thing about it is, there's nothing. So I think the only thing worse than being loud and wrong is being really polished and wrong. Right.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Right. So it's like okay,
yeah.
You got all you're talking. You got all the presentation.
Oh, sure.
And you got your little clicker and you got your 3 points and
that's so true.
Your pantsuit looks great.
Oh my gosh! It's in the corporate speak.
Right. It's in the corporate speak. You got all the, but
people can see through it.
But you're absolutely wrong. And your earlier point about Pride, yeah, and like this past year was so big because it was the 50th anniversary,
right,
of Stonewall, and it's interesting because you were talking just a bit about like the dissonance there and like the emotional labor for everyone who is a minority, but then specifically we're talking about trans activists, and it was so interesting because I believe it was on the 30th, like right at the end of Pride, there was a situation at Stonewall Inn where there was a desire from a trans woman to speak up. She wanted to talk a little bit about the day and just reflect, and she was shouted down by gay men who were there. In names of, hey, we just want to party, we don't want to hear all that. And eventually she was able to speak.
Thank goodness.
And she spoke for about 12 minutes, but it was just really interesting. She read the names of the black trans women who died and facts and the disproportionate abuse and oppression that black trans women have and continue to face. Yes. And so you're absolutely right. Like, and I think it's incredible. I've yet to have the privilege to directly interview a black trans activist. Like, that's actually a serious goal of mine.
I can hook you up.
Well, let's do it. Let's talk about that after the interview for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I it's been such a learning for me. And this is why I feel so the ally energy in me these days, even in the LGBTQ community technically that I'm in. Yeah. I feel so activated as and I don't even want to say like I'm an ally, because we're only allies when others give us that yes. name and that honor,
yes.
right?
Yes.
But I'll tell you, I whether it's me as a cis woman, I spend my time on the keynote stage asking people in the audience, how many of you know what I mean by sharing our pronouns and why it's important, and how many of you know what cisgender means, and sharing my identity and coming out as cisgender, so that or sharing my pronouns so that I'm not acting like heterosexuality and cisgenderness is normal. We have to make it visible in order to even point out to people that we shouldn't be assuming this is normal, and you shouldn't be walking around every day assuming everybody shares your identity. And we've done that. I mean, so many of us have been so comfortable. And, I'll share, the statistic probably, but it's so startling that out of every 5 people under 34 is non-cis and non-straight. So 1 out of 5.
Wow.
So as you walk around your life, as you hire people, as you work with teams, as you meet customers, 1 out of 5. And yet the chances are that they're hiding that from you and they're not comfortable. So what can you do to say, hey, this is a safe place? I am someone that you can bring your whole self to me, around me, and I will see you, and I will be not only just open to it, but I will be embracing of it, and I won't assume that you're like me. I won't. I will give you the chance to self-identify, and I will self-identify. I will be brave in doing that because I'm not going to put all the burden on you to talk about your experience, but I'm going to remain silent and not talk about mine. And it's funny because I get a lot of questions afterwards. People come up to me and say, how do I start that conversation with someone to say, hey, I'm doing my work. I'm trying to learn. I want you to feel comfortable. What would you like me to know? Here, and we sort of walk through how do I even start that conversation? Because people are they just don't know how to begin, and they don't know whether it will come across as authentic.
Yeah.
And they're worried they're going to be out of their depth really fast, which by the way, they will be.
and I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's the internal getting yourself comfortable with being uncomfortable and being comfortable with being ignorant, and ignorant truly meaning just not knowing and seeking to learn, right?
Right.
I think MLK Jr. talked about this. He was quoted saying something like, white people, as part of their superiority, think that they have so very little to learn when it comes to
oh my gosh,
when it comes to just race, right? Matters of race, and I think that can be extended and expanded, right? That if you're a part of a majority, a part of a privileged class, it's easy for you to think that you don't need to learn, but being curious, right, and seeking to understand is one of the greatest signs of humility, and really it's endearing. The right people, in my experience, when I come to people and I say, hey, I really just want to understand, I want to learn from you, I genuinely want to learn, those discussions go well. Because they
do,
right? They go well because you're humbling yourself to listen and to receive. I
know.
You talk about the statistics and the about 1 in 5 today. I think that really leads me well into the next question. So a good deal of your book discusses the future of work and the role inclusion will play. What are your predictions on how organizations will need to adapt to attract future diverse talent in the next 10 years?
Oh my gosh. Well, they're all woefully behind already and have been. It's like the ostrich with the head in the sand. I think, when business is good and the economy is good, it's like high tide, it covers up a lot of things that low tide reveals. And I think a lot of people are too comfortable. I just think that business leaders in particular, and to your point that you just made, right? If life is working out for me, I'm economically uncomfortable, I'm not afraid of, being pulled over, as I'm driving, I'm not afraid for my child in the world, all those things that are blind spots for some people, you can kind of sail on through life and through your work and being a leader, believe it or not, and not really be held accountable for a lot of these things. People deny that it's an urgent situation, but I see it as a really urgent situation, that the fact that the number of women and people of color at certain levels in companies, which I'm kind of obsessed with the mid-level, because the mid-level is where people, they're really tired of hanging on, white knuckling it through up the pipeline, trying to, get supported, get promoted, have somebody take an interest in them, have somebody run interference for them. When you're under-mentored and under-supported, and then you're underrepresented as well, and you look around and you look up and you don't see anyone that, we say you got to see it to be it, you get tired. And it's no wonder to me that the numbers in the representation of anyone who's not a straight white male have been kind of really flatlined, and even the best and most progressive companies are really struggling to hold on to people, to raise them up to the level where I want to see them, right? Which is the executive level, because then they can make a whole world of difference. An executive leader can, with one signature, create a policy or address the pay gap. They have so much power, or hold a customer accountable, or take a stance on a political issue in social media. And so if we can't make it up there, and we decide to bail out because it just proves too arduous, right, and we're just like physically tired, and we're emotionally tired, and the compassion fatigue and the emotional labor and all of it, being the spokesperson for an entire community, it becomes too much. And, then we leave and we create our own businesses, which is a great solution, which is, the thing I did.
Right.
Because I was like, this is not going to work for me. But that's a loss, because not everybody is set up to be an entrepreneur. Right. You need a lot of capital. You need talk about privilege. You need certain things in place in order to make that work. And it's just not tenable for most people. So workplaces have to work for people, for all of us. Right. So the future of work, I get asked a lot about quotas and targets. I personally, I hesitate to say this like super publicly, because companies are really twitchy about requirements and quotas. Yeah. And you get a lot of pushback. But I honestly, I'm at a point where I feel like if people are left to their own devices, change doesn't happen. And if change does happen, it's slow, and it's not widespread, and it's too slow to make a meaningful difference in the short amount of time we have to really see change.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think the house is on fire. I think economically people are falling behind. They're not getting promoted. They're therefore missing out on economic growth and opportunity and wealth. And I'm just not seeing it. And at the time when the world is changing so fast and companies are not keeping up with it. And so is the bottom line impacted? Is ROI measured? We have to have like an honest conversation about losing customers and clients and people leaving the organization, and companies have to wake up and say, if we don't do something really serious about this, we're going to be sitting in the same exact place in 10 years. So, I'm all for the more radical solutions. I think interview slates need to have a required number of women on them and a required number of people of diverse ethnicities.
Yes.
LGBTQ is tough because we don't disclose. So the companies I work with struggle with something called self-identification. We don't trust our company, and this is just speaks volumes. We don't trust our companies enough to check a box about who we really are. So we can't be counted. So, there has to be like faith that we exist in organizations upwards of maybe 10% of the population, because we're only recorded at like 1%.
Yeah, and that's just not accurate, right?
It's not accurate, but we're doing that because we're terrified.
Right.
We're terrified of losing our job. We're just, even in the best companies, and that's true for people with disabilities too, but I think companies have to, and I think they're going to get pushback if they roll things out like this. They're going to get a lot of pushback. Yeah. People are going to say, I don't want to be forced to, I believe in a meritocracy, and I want to hire the best person for the job, and you can't force me to hire a candidate that's less than. And what my answer to that is, if you did a good job of having enough of a pipeline of all kinds of talent, it wouldn't just be one candidate you're looking at and you're feeling like somebody has is forcing you, holding your feet to the fire to hire them. You would have lots of choices. Right. And so we've got to do a better job of filling that pipeline, keeping people in the pipeline, not letting them leave, and investing in them so that they feel they can thrive at a company long term, instead of wanting to bail out because they can't stand it anymore. That's just a sad commentary on workplace culture. But unfortunately, I think it's the experience of tons of people that I talk to.
Well, no, the thing about it is the challenge with it is like your earlier point around change, like not, that it, if left to its own device, will happen so incrementally, so small that it won't
slowly.
It won't happen, and I think
it won't be meaningful.
It won't be. It
won't even be big enough. Yeah,
and I think when you look at American history and you look at the history of civil rights in this country, it's really, I just don't know if we have like a tangible example of truly radical, sustained change from a culture perspective in this country. I think when you look across, especially when you look at like this current presidency, it's actually forced a lot of people to really like look at the history of race relations in America, especially if you want to examine like the past 55, 60 years, and you look at, and if you look at like the economic positioning of blacks today versus blacks in 1967, you know, like you don't see the needle moving much at all. In fact, in certain way, in a lot of areas, you see the needle moving down. So it's interesting. Right. So I 100% agree with you that there needs to be some genuinely radical, I'm gonna use the word again, radical change and thought in terms of just what it's going to look like, because and we talk about this in another interview too. We talk about the future of work and talk about the future of learning and education. You know, as the economy shifts and changes, and more and more folks are not going to school because school's going to continue to get more expensive, and like all of that's it's going to create a completely new environment that I don't know if we're really taking the time to really examine and consider.
I know when we're still having the conversation with managers to say, hey, you know, don't hire from the school you went to. That's bias.
Right.
You know, literally, that's where we are. You're talking about like the 3.0, which is literally that people are not going to have these traditional college degrees or any degree. They'll go to trade school or whatever it is. Like they're going to have completely non-traditional backgrounds. They will have been, you know, previously incarcerated. Right. They will be, you know, different statuses, and we have to figure out, like, workplaces need all the talent they can get, and yet they're completely behind in terms of how they seek that talent, where they look. People like throw their hands up so too easily, you know, to say, oh, we just couldn't find anyone. You know, it's just like endless, the stories I hear. And I don't know, it's laziness. It's I don't even know. I mean, depends on the day, like how cynical I am about it all, but I don't know. I just am like, really, like if you really wanted to find people, they're there. And believe me, like, cause I'm on Twitter, and like Black Twitter is on fire. Like, yes, you know, the number of angel investment groups, the number of VCs, the number of startups, the number of Black girls who code.
Yes.
Like there's such a great community to recruit from. And I wonder, like, what is it that people aren't doing or won't do? What is the holdup?
Oh no, 100%.
Yeah.
You know what, Jennifer? I'm gonna say this. Hold on. You know what? You're a real one. I appreciate you. That's a really good call out, because you're absolutely right. Like Black Twitter is popping, and like there's so many pools, right, of talent for you to engage. Right. There's Black Code Collective, like in DC. Like there's all types of stuff. Like there are people, and like to your point around like how people are learning today. There are people who went to culinary school and then like are now learned how to code. And like
that's so awesome.
They're good at it, right? Like there are communities now that will welcome you in for free. You can learn, and you can genuinely understand and learn how to code. And so there's plenty of opportunity to deepen your pipeline. So so that's a really good point. It's like there are things that people either aren't doing or choosing not to do, but the talent is definitely out there. You know, you talked about cynicism. I think that really leads to my next question. Like, can we take a step back and just talk about like D&I or I&D as an industry, right? Like,
speaking of cynicism, I want to know where you're going with this. I'm ready to go there with you too. So
there's
I think I know.
So there's a growing sentiment, right, that the largest voices who are advocating for diversity and inclusion in highly visible in corporate or corporatized spaces are themselves members of the majority, and by relation have some inherent blind spots within the subject matter that they espouse expertise in. Do you find any merit to that concern? And like, if so, what have you done to challenge your own blind spots? And you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I'd love for you to expound on that. And if you have any other advice you would give to others.
That is such an interesting observation. It's funny because I could make the counter argument that I think we're in a time, like you ask any white diversity leader right now, and their credibility is questioned on a daily basis to be in the role they're in. that is the truth.
Yeah.
In fact, they get like threats.
Really?
I've seen some people get some serious heat. Just for having the audacity of even having the position or accepting that position.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So there's just many stories, right, on all sides of this issue. And like I said, I don't know if I said earlier, but when you're in the marginalized community, it also doesn't mean that you're a great leader on inclusion.
That's
necessarily.
True. That's true.
Necessarily.
Yeah.
Because I've seen plenty of, like we were talking about, white gay men at Stonewall, who are, can be like very misogynistic, very racist, very, and so that can carry forward into a diversity leader role, but that doesn't mean that all of them are totally, not effective practitioners. And it also doesn't mean because you're a person of color that you're an effective practitioner.
That's right. That's
so
right.
To me, you respect this. It's a skill set. It is a skill set, but it is also your identity, right? And it's how you deal with your identity in the world. And it's how you integrate those two things that makes you an effective voice. But also you've got to be an incredibly savvy change agent to have these roles. I mean, they're very difficult roles. They're some of the most complex roles that exist, I think, in business, because it's part influencing, it's part executive, believability, credibility, it's passion, it's change agility. It is storytelling, right? And being but incredibly data oriented and, convincing and knowing the business so that you can make the business case, right? So you need to know the business you're in order to make the argument for D&I. And you've got to be able to do all those things. And by the way, you're probably part of a marginalized community and you're dealing with all of the biases personally, right, that you're getting at the same time as you're leading an entire institution, through this morass, through these really difficult, tense and, complex times. So it's really one of the toughest roles. And I have so much respect. I worry about our practitioner community, both on the consulting side, but really my internal clients, because they're holding up this planet, these giant organizations. But anyway, to answer your question, who's allowed and who has permission to do this work? It's a very good question. I mean, I've been questioned, because somebody hasn't dug into who I am and has judged me just based on what I look like.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I mean, I would say, it hurts me, but whatever, that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I think it's most important, I think, for us not to judge each other. I think for us to look at the skill set objectively. But I do think the optics of people in these roles are important. You have to be a really amazing, humble leader. You have to be really deep in the work, I think, to take on that role as a majority identity. If you're a white guy, I don't know a lot of actually white straight guys in these roles. Yeah. I do know white gay guys. And every day, their privilege is pointed out to them. Every day. Yeah. Nobody lets them forget that they have an enormous responsibility in that role, and that they have a lot of work to do. And you talk to any of them, and I know some of my clients are that identity, and it's a tough lift for them. I know some straight white women, and again, they're pretty enlightened people. They're very humble, and they're very they've been studying this for a long time. Yeah. Some of them have sort of really personal relationships. I know a lot of gay white women actually in these roles. Yeah. And sometimes I know gay women of color in these roles, and they're amazing. I mean, amazing. In the intersectionality they can bring to it is deep. Yeah. And I find, not to say certain combinations of identities are more potent, but to be able to speak to so many different identities in your workforce, in a direct way, there's kind of, that's a wonderful shortcut to be able to do that. And on top of that, be somebody who's been in HR for 20 years, and is super savvy about playing the politics and all the other things you need for the role. But I would like to think we all have a role to play. I will tell you some inside baseball. Sometimes I get asked to send, a white man to a consulting engagement. And that is true. And we will push back. We will say, we're not sure that's the right answer. and let's talk about it. And you know, sometimes strangely it is the right answer for certain groups who've been really, really recalcitrant and resistant. And the messenger matters sometimes more than the message. Like certain people can be heard in certain ways, and we know this is true. So that's why we have such tremendous diversity on our consulting team. Because we have to get creative sometimes and make sure that we build a pairing, for example, that's going to be in front of a room, that maybe the client is really, really struggling to be heard in front of this business unit or this team or this, office in a certain region in the country. And we'll need to switch it out. We'll need to put a different voice in front of people to see, and sadly, the messenger is something that needs to be considered. And I wouldn't let it rest, and I wouldn't not challenge it. But I do think we've got to use every change tool in our arsenal, particularly with those who are really resistant and really stuck, and I think experiencing a lot of bias per the messenger that they're hearing the message from. I have to be really careful. I can't be the angry woman and the angry gay person. And I can't imagine what it would be like delivering that truthful message that I do, and also being a person of color, right? I'm very aware that I have a lot more latitude for my quote unquote passion to come through, right? And to be, and not to have it seen as being threatening.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And your point around like changing up the messenger and mixing it up, it's really interesting because in the work that I've done, I have a similar strategy, and it's interesting because I do that without even being asked. Like, I'll just be like, look, I know that for this, I just need to have a really approachable white face to deliver this message, and their partners for me in that. And honestly, Jennifer, I do that even just at work. Like, if I have a big meeting,
of course,
right? Like, if I have a big meeting or like, there's just something going on. I was like, okay, I really want to share this thing, but I know that if I say it, then it's going to get an eye roll or it's not going to be heard. So let me go ahead and mobilize this white woman or this white guy. Yes. And then I'll have them say it, or I will let them know that I'm about to say it. Say it again.
Right. I just wish that weren't true, like that you have to do that. And that's, to me, that's like the extra tax that we pay.
Right.
That's extra labor.
Right.
That you have to literally not only have the brilliant idea, but you have to like strategize about who's like sitting next to you or, backing you up when you have a brilliant idea, or like who's going to echo your, like, but it's, women deal with this, and we all know
absolutely
this is like a fact of life.
Yeah.
I mean, but I appreciate what you're bringing up, that it's a universal experience for so many of us.
Yes.
And if we look at it on the bright side, let's like look at it as glass half full, which I always do. I think this all makes us really savvy, like very emotionally intelligent, right? Because as limited as our audience might be, it doesn't just make us, it sort of sharpens our saw.
It does.
I mean, I think when you have to think about, how am I going to get this group over the finish line? Like, how am I going to get them to listen to me, to believe in what I say, and to give me the credibility when I'm walking in the room and I know what they're thinking about me? How am I going to do that? And to me, it's like it's a brain twister, but it makes you be very creative. And by the way, I hope in enlisting those allies that they know why they're being enlisted, and that it really raises their awareness, the permutations that so many of us go through in the workplace to be heard. That's the really important learn, to be approached by someone to say, hey, would you have my meeting? I'm going to bring this up. And, to me, that is like such a sad commentary. And at the same time, it's such a demonstration of how far we have to go for people to be heard, and the space that we all have to learn to hold for each other. Yes. Like, we've got to do that. You know what? We need to do that without being asked. That's where I really want to get, right?
That's right.
So that if I'm in this meeting and I hear you bring up this brilliant idea, you don't even need to ask me to have your back. Like, I am going to instinctively know if you're talked over or somebody steals your idea or somebody poo-poos it, that I'm going to intervene and I'm going to know what's going on. And that, to me, that would be sort of nirvana in the workplace, where that those pre-conversations, that pre-planning that you just described doesn't even need to happen.
Right. Because
everyone knows it's an issue and everyone's on guard for it. Like, can you imagine? Like, if we were all like, oh, no, she is not going to be talked over, or his idea is not going to be dismissed.
Right.
And I'm going to quote it, and I'm going to bring the attention back to him. And his it's like the women in the Obama cabinet. I love that story where they literally decided like that this is not going to happen anymore, and they all banded together and made the plan.
Yes,
and then they went into the meeting, and they all like echoed each other's ideas and mentioned each other by name and made eye contact with other women in the room. So they sort of redirected everybody's attention. I'm still, believe it or not, if I go into a meeting with my male colleague, they will talk to him.
I believe that.
It still happens to me.
I believe that.
Oh, yeah. And I'm the CEO, and he works for me, So, it's still a thing. And he's really good because he'll, like, redirect back to me. Like, he'll...
Actually, Ms. Brown, what do you think?
Yes. Well, he'll say, well, as Jennifer always says.
Yes.
Right. As somebody who is an acknowledged expert.
Yes.
I love that. But yeah, we need to do that. And that would be nirvana. So I really talk about that a lot in my book. It's like the emotional labor of having to ask for help. I really, really wish more of us would know that help is needed. Like, we would know the data, we would know the research. For God's sake, like, read the McKinsey report on women that they do every year. Yeah.
So good.
It's so good. Like, and you'll realize that women of color have different headwinds than white women. Just that, And if you go into meetings and you see this dynamic and you have any level of privilege, any level of positional power, where you're listened to in a different way, you need to activate that so that you change those numbers and those outcomes. Like, you must do that. And it's such a small thing. This takes 2 seconds. Like, that's the thing when people are like, oh, inclusion takes so much time and I'm so busy and, I don't know how it competes with the business priorities and I have a long list and like, I'm already strapped for, time. And I don't think this takes a lot of time. It just takes a moment of attention to bias your own, others, a moment to a quick conversation, to check in with somebody, a request for feedback, hey, I want to follow up with you after that meeting. Like, I really thought your idea was great. I want to support you. How can I do more of that? That takes 2 seconds to say. And like you said earlier, it's so welcome. Like, I think that when people are like, I don't know how to start that conversation. It's like, most of these conversations are like a gift to so many people who are never asked these questions to begin with, right? So please approach me, ask me, how can you support me more differently? What could you say in a meeting? What could you say after a meeting to someone when I'm not around? I think that's the other piece, right? Like, give feedback to people that look like you. Like I always say, men listen to other men in a very different way. Yeah. And so, if you've got that privilege of being listened to, the messenger, not just the message. And you can take the burden off of my shoulders to have a hard conversation with somebody to say, hey, that joke made me uncomfortable. Like, that's a very risky move for me to do.
It is.
Because that is drawing attention to my difference. Yep. I have no idea how that person's going to react. And so I really, as a woman, I really appreciate men who proactively are like, what can I do to really, it's kind of protect you in a way. And it's not protect in a sort of damsel in distress kind of way. It is literally like, it could be protecting an idea. It can be, making sure you don't fall victim to politics in the office.
Right.
It can be that I represent you when you're not in the room and I talk about how brilliant you are. It's that kind of thing. Because otherwise we're sort of hanging out in the wind. And one of the things I always say is diverse talent is under-mentored and very under-sponsored, which means that we're not, we literally aren't looked after, informally. We are not, somebody's not like, well, let me have that career conversation with her to make sure that she's up for that role so that she has P&L experience so that she's then positioned so she can get that promotion, because there's all these like unspoken and unwritten rules that we're not privy to when you're not in the power structure. And so I often task people I speak to say, like, look at the people you mentor, look at the people you sponsor. Do they look like you? If they do, and you are a certain demographic, like, you must remedy that. Like, you've got to be mentoring across different, sponsoring across different. And by the way, it should be reverse mentoring as well. It should be mutual so that you're learning, to your point earlier, like, how are you getting your learning about cultural differences? It's in the context of these really, really important one-on-one relationships. So wherever you can power share, wherever you can be influenced or learn somebody's experience, as a senior executive, your biggest risk is that you're isolated from all of this. And therefore, you're not an effective leader. You're not positioning yourself for the future. You're harming your company because you're setting this vision every day, but you there's so much you don't know. So, I think that's a good wake-up call for people usually. And if that doesn't work, what, I don't know. I give up.
I don't know.
I'm like, I've given you now 2 books to read, 63 podcast episodes.
Right.
Come on.
What more do you want from
what
me?
What more do you need? It's writing on the wall. Wake up. Get on the train.
Yes.
And be willing to make mistakes, as we were talking about earlier, and even know how to do a good apology, because I think there's a real art to a real apology too. I think you said earlier, there's nothing worse than somebody who says all the right things, but in this really authentic kind of faux,
yes,
polished way.
You know what? We're gonna have you back to talk about the topic of apologizing.
Yeah, right. I love that apology. I love that topic. Sorry.
No, you're good.
But a good apology can make up for everything, and it's almost like a required skill set, particularly for those in the majority, because things are going to happen. You're going to mess it up. You are, and so being comfortable with uncomfortable, comfortable with hard feedback, and to me, not slinking away into the corner, but saying, "Thank you so much for that, and I'm going to try it again, and I'm going to do it differently." Wouldn't that resilience be really neat to hear and see in our leaders?
It would be great.
Yeah, I know.
Believe it or not, I'm actually a little bit encouraged coming out of this conversation. This has been really good.
Really?
Yeah, I am.
That's good, because we talked about some cynical stuff.
we did, but it was real though.
Yeah, it is. It's such a mixed bag. But you said earlier, we're living in these really interesting times of awakening, and you're right. I think ever since the 2016 election, I would say, is when so many people and so many companies were like, "Oh my goodness, MLK Jr., the arc of the moral universe long, but it bends towards justice."
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes. But guess what? We have to bend the arc.
Right.
The arc isn't going to bend itself.
Right.
That's the thing. So to me, we got to take that and bend it. And I think what we realized is it's not this destiny. Things aren't going to happen and they aren't going to happen because of good intentions. They're not going to happen because we have maybe progressive values. They're not going to happen because, I'm a male leader and I have daughters, so therefore, I'm an expert on gender equality. Right. No. You have to do something, and you have to do something publicly, consistently, constantly. I use the example in the book of Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, who discovered he had a huge pay gap and literally wrote a check for $3 million, right away. And was like, I'm going to gross up pay for people because I'm not going to let this stand another day. Then we're going to do the harder work, right? Which is rooting out, why did this happen in the first place?
Right.
And then as he's done this, he does it every year now. They've discovered, by the way, pay gap, not just gender, but ethnicity pay gaps. Right. Not surprising.
Right.
And then they've acquired so many tens of companies that also had pay gaps as Salesforce acquired them, and they had to do a new audit, and to look at their pay gaps and, gross it up. And, so literally there are people that are just being relentless on this because under their watch, they aren't going to let this persist. And so I do see a lot of courage amongst leaders, and that leaves me really hopeful. I wish I saw it more, and I wish I saw it more publicly. I think there's a lot of really interesting conversations going on privately with lawyers and, the board, and, and sometimes I'm privy to those, and I'm really, really heartened by the interest I see in the C-suite. I have to say, people are getting it. And I think their question now is, how do we change it?
Yeah.
And that's a much harder question to answer when you're dealing with a giant organization that does business all over the world and has to contend with laws in various parts of the world. It's hard to know where to start. And I think that's where people are at, but they want to start. And that's a relief to me. It makes my job easier because I'm not fighting the why is this important battle all the time, we're able to like roll up our sleeves and consider, okay, let's get started. And it doesn't need to be perfect. We're not going to accomplish everything in the first year. I love that you want gender parity, next year, but please don't shout that from the rooftops and promise it to your board, because, you have some problems and you don't just want to fix things cosmetically. You really want to build it to last,
Absolutely.
So I am hopeful too. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be in this space. It'd be just too damn frustrating.
No doubt. No doubt. Jennifer, this has been an amazing conversation. And
I know.
I feel like we can keep on going. But
Me too.
Before we go, do you have any parting words or shout outs?
Oh my gosh. Well, can I give people the info about where to find me and my work?
All of that. Let it go.
Awesome. Okay. So my new book is coming out August, How to Be an Inclusive Leader. That's my second book. My first book is called Inclusion. And it came out, as I said, in 2016. Good timing at the end of the year. My podcast is called The Will to Change, and I call it True Stories of Diversity and Inclusion. I've had some really amazing people on there. And on Twitter, I'm at Jennifer Brown. Yes, I've been on Twitter for 10 years. I got my own name. It's pretty awesome. I love Twitter. I learned, like we talked about earlier, learned so much from those long threads where everybody's arguing about things. Like, please read them, study them, listen a lot. Start to, study your language and get ideas for how you should approach things. Twitter is great for that, and disturbing for all the reasons that we know. Yeah. Jennifer Brown Speaks on Instagram, and then Facebook and LinkedIn. I think I'm Jennifer Brown Consulting, but if people are interested in getting on our mailing list, please go to jenniferbrownspeaks.com, and right on the homepage you can join. And please pick up a copy of the second book, which is really about the conversation we had today. It's honestly about folks who are kind of sitting on the sidelines. How can you get into the fray, but in a thoughtful way, in a way that doesn't cause more labor for others? How do you do the get ready to apologize, because you probably will need to? Yeah. But get in to the game, even if it's in a very small way, even if it's in a private way, just begin. And I think that if I could have more leaders sort of be less intimidated about the whole process and show a way forward, it's like, come in, the water's warm. Like, I hope you won't get hurt. There might be some high feelings, but everyone is needed because the task is enormous. And so that's my goal, to kind of make it more comfortable for people to do more.
So Jennifer, first of all, two things. We're going to make sure we have all the information in the show notes, so we'll make sure everybody knows that. And then we also on the website have our own favorite things, and we'll make sure to have both of your books listed as favorite things. So
you're
we
the
got
best. You.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Jennifer, we definitely consider you a friend of the show. We can't wait to have you back. We'll talk soon.
Count me in, always.
All
Thank you.
Peace.
Peace.
Living Corporate is a podcast by Living Corporate LLC. Our logo was designed by David Dawkins. Our theme music was produced by Ken Brown. Additional music production by Antoine Franklin for Musical Elevation. Post-production is handled by Jeremy Jackson. Got a topic suggestion? Email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and living-corporate.com. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.